Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I will tell you the story about the Swedish Queen Christina's coronation, which took place on October 20th in 1650 and has gone down in the Swedish history as one of the most lavish and attention-grabbing coronations. She turned down the traditional coronation location in Uppsala and refused to wear the Queen's crown. The most spectacular and expensive coronation in the country's history ended with a scandal. It was, in short, a spectacular story. I will illustrate the story with coronation medals, all from my own private coin cabinet, all of which were once handed out as gifts or used as largesse money in connection with the coronation. The most impressive is the gold medal weighing 6.5 ducats engraved by Erich Parise. The gold medal is part of my private coin cabinet, and there is only 2 known specimens in the private market. The other known specimen was part of Baron Bonde's collection. But before I tell you more about the spectacular coronation, I thought I'd give you a little background and prelude to the coronation. Christina's coronation had been discussed on and off since she came of age in 1644. Due to the still ongoing so-called 30 Years' War and its slow peace negotiations, which had begun in 1645 and only ended in October 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, the Council and the Queen decided to postpone the coronation until later. During 1649, the discussions regarding the coronation intensified, and the Council and the Queen planned for a long time that the coronation would be held in Uppsala according to tradition. However, it was decided at the end of May that the coronation would take place in Stockholm instead. In addition to the wars and the long drawn-out peace negotiations that delayed the coronation, there were also unrest, disorder, famine and discontent in the country. When the estates gathered before the 1650 coronation parliament to attend the Queen's coronation later in October, the mood was extremely irritated. Sweden had just had 2 years of failed crops and famine, and 1650 looked to be yet another bad year. Many starving people had gathered in Stockholm, and the poor lay starving and dying in the streets, begging for help. Bark bread, soup of twigs, lichen, and roots belonged to the normal diet of the peasants at the time. Moreover, discontent was particularly widespread among the 3 lower estates against the parasitic nobility and its extensive privileges. At the parliament, the 3 lower estates, borgare, farmers and priests, demanded that the Queen should reverse the so-called reduction, which meant that the Queen and the state should take back previously given away or sold estates from the nobility. In September, the 3 lower estates presented the proposition, and they also emphasized that they had no revolutionary plans at all, but, on the contrary, they believed that the Queen and they had common interests in limiting the power of the nobility. An important issue was the taxation of the farmers. Under the nobility's ownership and administration, the relationship was abused and the pressure on the tax farmers became unbearable. Christina now pursued a dual policy and played out the lower estates against the nobility, who felt the hard pressure. Christina's plan was that she would later come to the nobility's aid in exchange for her cousin Carl Gustaf being recognized as hereditary prince. In the Parliament of 1649, the Council had refused to agree to Christina's demand for this. The nobility now felt hard-pressed by the proposal of the lower estates, which contained strong attacks on the nobility's possessions, and then did as it always does in severe situations. It sought support from the monarch, and they asked for the Queen's protection. Christina had now succeeded in her game. On the same day that the petition was handed over to her, she presented the proposal that Carl Gustaf should be accepted as hereditary prince. What had been rejected in the previous year's parliament was now unanimously approved by the shaken council. However, the fact that Carl Gustaf was now elected hereditary prince did not mean that he immediately gained any political influence. Carl Gustaf had to give an assurance in which he promised to stay out of politics, and then he retired dissatisfied to the countryside. As he was a few years older than his cousin the Queen, it seemed uncertain whether he would ever reach political power. Little did he or anyone around him know that Christina had already made her decision to abdicate, but first all the pieces of the puzzle had to fall into place, with the choice of a crown prince being one of the most important. Christina's interest in the lower estate's demand for reduction and prohibition of further separation cooled considerably after she had achieved her goal of having Carl Gustaf recognized as hereditary prince. On the contrary, it was in the years after 1650 that the distribution of state property to the nobility reached the greatest extent. Christina generously distributed the state property to her favorites. During Christina's reign, the nobility doubled from about 300 to 600, and the parasitic class thus grew very strongly. The consequences were manifold. Partly the burden of the tax farmers increased, partly the state tax revenue decreased as a direct consequence of this. In principle, the nobility had free control over the tax farmers and could force them to work any number of days on their estates, of course without any compensation. This almost feudal system began to be slowly regulated in 1651, where the relationship between the nobility and its tax peasants took place. To return to the coronation itself, and we shall consider this most lavish and attention-grabbing coronation in Swedish history against the contrasting reality of the new rich, great superpower in Europe and de facto poor peasant state of Sweden, where starving and dying people lay in the streets, while Christina squandered the country's assets on a great court and spectacular coronation. Christina nurtured a dream to make Stockholm a cultural city that could compete with the big cities on the continent, and also spared no expense to achieve her goals. However, we must consider that Stockholm at this time was inhabited by no more than about 10,000 people, and in comparison with the role models and metropolises such as Paris and Rome, both of which were large cities with several 100,000 inhabitants, and boasted the rich Roman heritage of magnificent and hard-to-reach architecture and splendor. As I earlier said, the planning for the coronation had been going on for a long time, and huge orders for various kinds has been placed in Paris several years in advance. Perhaps the most magnificent object was the silver throne that Magnus Gabriel de la Gardie had given to the Queen in connection with the coronation. In connection with the coronation and its procession, a series of magnificent medals was also ordered to be distributed. At this time, Johan Wrede and Erich Parise, who had recently moved to Sweden, were working at the mint in Stockholm, and both of them were contracted to produce coronation medals. Parise was the older of the two, and with his French ancestry, he was considered the more experienced, and thus also first in line to produce more medals. As previously said, both had recently arrived to Sweden, and the first medals executed by them were both for Christina's coronation, and the composition was similar between Wrede's and Parise's medals. Parise's medals are considered to be more plastic and smooth in appearance, and Wrede's more strict, which may be due to Wrede's schooling in Riga. The medals are clearly produced after initiative and designs from the Queen herself, who wanted to appear according to her ancient Roman ideals, where her portrait resembles a Roman goddess. The medals were struck in several sizes, where the diameters vary from approximately 45 mm for the largest to approximately 22 mm for the smallest, where several sizes also appear in gold, and both as signed and unsigned by the engravers. However, it should be stated that the gold specimens, with a few exceptions, are only part of the museum collections and are thus not available on the private collector's market. It was an impressive spectacle that a 24-year-old Queen Christina staged in October 1650. The coronation was the grandest in the country's history, and the festivities lasted for months. The beginning of the festivities was the ceremonial procession that started from Ulriksdal Castle into Stockholm and the Royal Palace. The procession was so long that when the first arrived at the Royal Palace in Stockholm, the last had not yet left Ulriksdal. In the procession we can see all kinds of entertainments, such as trumpeters, drummers, companies of riders, carriages, guided horses, servants, soldiers, mules, etc. All the country's prominent executives and foreign diplomats also attended, and exotic items such as camels were also on display. On a copper engraving made by Johann Sasse in the 1650s, the procession at Queen Christina's coronation is depicted. To the left, in the upper corner, is Stockholm Storkyrka, which was the final destination of the coronation procession. Christina herself sat in the coronation carriage drawn by 6 horses, and the Queen's coronation carriage was escorted by 8 nobles on horseback, and on either side of the carriage 30 young nobles were marching. The main part of the very lavish equipment, such as costumes, saddles, saddlebags, carriages, etc., were ordered from France, from where the artistic role models were taken. When the Queen's carriage arrived at the castle, cannon fire began from the castle and from the 40 warships. During the following reception, a large firework was set up from Skeppsholmen, which lasted for over 1 hour, and the gunpowder smoke lay like a fog over the city. 3 days later, the coronation procession departs from the castle, through the city and to the church, where Christina was received at the church gate by the archbishop, who traditionally greeted the regent with, "Blessed be he that cometh in the name of the Lord." That she was crowned in Stockholm was against tradition, as Uppsala was the place of coronation according to custom. She also went against tradition when she, shortly before the coronation, decided not to be crowned in the Queen's crown, which had recently been remade for her, but instead in her father's crown, which also was an old crown made for King Erich XIV. The coronation itself began with a sermon by Bishop of Strängnäs, Johannes Mattie. When it was time for the actual coronation, Christina got up from the throne and went to the altar, where she put on the mantle. Christina, who was born to the throne, naturally allowed herself to be crowned with the conviction that everyone had at the time, namely that the prince has received his power directly from God, and that the prince is only responsible to God, and that the people, her subjects, only existed to serve her. This view is clearly illustrated by the medals which were distributed in connection with the coronation. On the reverse of the medals is the arm of God depicted, emerging from the heavenly clouds, and handing the crown to the Queen, and with the Latin mottos such as "Avitam et actam," inherited and extended, "Non ali unde," not from elsewhere, and "Late Christina regit," Christina rules everywhere, accompanied by the heavenly symbolisms. After the mantle was put on, she fell to her knees and swore the oath with her hand on the Bible. After this, she was anointed with holy oil and thus became regent by the grace of God, regit dei gratia. Christina then took her seat on the De la Guardia silver throne to receive the regalias. The archbishop placed a crown on Christina's head, and then she received the scepter, the apple, the key, and finally the sword. The coronation party at the castle lasted until 4 o'clock in the morning. The distinguished guests dined in Rikssalen, where Christina sat at a raised table. In short, the money flowed like never before. A long cavalcade of parties, ballets, banquets, animal fights, jousting, etc. went on without interruption. Large fireworks were set off almost every night, and over 1,800 salutes were fired, and 40 warships lay on Stockholm Stream, and special so-called gates of honor were erected in several places in Stockholm. The celebration also took part in the city. On Stortorget, the citizens were treated to a whole roasted coronation ox stuffed with turkey, geese and chickens, and fountains with wine were set up in several places in the town, from which wine flowed for 3 days. The parties went on into the early morning and then continued against the next day. For a few years, Christina enjoyed being crowned queen of a novo-rich great power. The three-corner castle was decorated with stolen works of art brought home from the European battlefields by the greatest masters, and her bookshelves were filled with stolen books as well. The books that were written by Catholics were forbidden in Sweden, but since Christina was above the law, she read them with great pleasure and great contentment. In no other country was Protestantism so strong and Catholicism so forbidden as in Sweden. Christina, despite her position, must approach Catholicism with the utmost caution. The ordinary citizen who had a contact with Catholics was labelled as an enemy of the state and a traitor and risked the death penalty. And the one who received Catholic scriptures was labelled as a rebel. Only 4 years after the coronation, what Christina had planned for a long time happened. She abdicated the throne of Sweden. Early in the morning of June 6, 1654, the Queen, her cousin Carl Gustaf and the Privy Council gathered in the Queen's room at Uppsala Castle. The Queen's abdication, Carl Gustaf's royal declaration and Christina's maintenance were signed and sealed. After that, Christina was dressed for the last time with full coronation attributes, and the 5 high officials in turn handed over the royal regalia to her, and finally Per Brahe put the crown on her head. When all this was finished, Christina, followed by the nobility and the councillors, entered the parliament shortly after 9 o'clock. The abdication ceremony was just like the coronation, but in reverse. She took off the symbols of power one by one and finally stood only in a white silk dress. The ceremony ended with a speech by Christina where she thanked God for being born into a famous family and being allowed to rule over a powerful kingdom. Then she thanked the Lord Protector of the kingdom who ruled so wisely after her father's death. She thanked the estates for their love, loyalty and obedience. After the speech, Carl Gustaf was proclaimed the new king and was crowned later that afternoon. After the abdication, she left Sweden and the destination of her journey was Rome, where she later settled and lived until her death in 1689. On the way to Rome, her secret conversion to Catholicism takes place in Brussels on Christmas night 1654, and a little later the official conversion takes place on November 3rd, 1655 in Innsbruck. This was, without comparison, the greatest triumph of the Catholic Church. The daughter of the greatest champion of Protestantism, the hero King Gustav Adolf, had been converted and decided to settle in Rome. And Christina's official entry into Rome took place the day before Christmas Eve in 1655. Finally, on April 19th, in the morning of 1689, she died, surrounded by her doctor, some nuns and a priest, as well as her constant and intimate friend Cardinal Azzolino. Her funeral was one of the grandest Rome had experienced and certainly the most lavish a woman had ever experienced. Christina became the first woman to be buried in the choir under St. Peter's Church, in the so-called Grotte Vecchie. In 1702, Pope Clemens XI had a memorial set up in a real place of honor, just to the right of the main entrance to St. Peter's Church. Here, too, Christina was the first. No other woman had been shown such an honor. And here ends the first episode about Christina's life. In future episodes, I will go back in history and talk about the birth, upbringing and life, about Sweden's transformation from poor peasant country to a major power in Europe. I will also give a more detailed description of her struggle with her identity as a woman and the underlying motivations for the abdication and conversion. Finally, I will also deal with the time after the abdication, the political game in the European arena and her life in Rome. I hope you find this video interesting, and to help others with a historical and or numismatic interest watch this video, please like, share, comment and subscribe. It is free to subscribe and you don't commit to anything, nor will you receive any unwanted emails or offers from me, and you can, whenever you want, end your subscription. By subscribing, liking and sharing, you help YouTube's and Google's algorithms to rank up this video and thus make it easier for others with a similar interest to view this video. Also, make sure to hit the notification bell to get notified when I publish new video on YouTube. Thank you for watching.